In every society, there are always a few journalists who take on the complicated, in-depth reporting that we call global muckraking. It's those kind of stories that change society, change governments, and often have a huge impact. Joel Simon, the executive director of the Committee to Protect Journalists, calls these the vanguard journalists. But whether we call them vanguard journalists or global muckrakers, the thing to remember is that when something happens to them, like they get arrested or even killed, they're hard to replace. There are very few people who can do what they do, and they leave a vacuum behind. The global muckrakers who cover oil, gas, and mining are a special breed of journalists. They face unique pressures. The problems of the extractive sector countries are deep and require a lot of expertise to cover. The pressures on those journalists can be intense. So we're going to talk this week about those journalists and some of the stories that they've reported on. Some of the very bravest muckrakers who've covered the extractives have been jailed or killed because of their journalism. But first, we're going to talk a little bit about resource booms and what happens to countries that have them. The process of extraction has an enormous impact on the countries where it takes place. The extractive companies themselves, the oil companies and the mining companies, have a very large influence on the governments and the countries where they operate. They bring in a huge amount of revenue, and that contributes to countries' economies, or what we call the gross domestic product. Where the money goes from the extractives is a very important question for societies. The Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative was founded to help governments reveal information about the money that they get. Countries that are compliant with what we call the EITI disclose information about things like tax payments, licenses, contracts, production, and other key elements around the resource extraction. For journalists and for the rest of us, two important key figures for us to look at in order to understand how important the extractive sector is to a particular economy or country is the percentage of a government budget that comes from revenues from extraction. Another figure to look at is the percentage of the country's economy or gross domestic product that comes from extractives revenue. Both of these metrics are key indicators in a country's economy and can also show us or give an indication of how dependent a country or a government may be on revenues from extraction. We like to imagine that having all of this wealth from oil, gas, or mining is a wonderful boom for a country and will help a country develop. But in fact, there are lots of downsides, which we will now briefly look at. The way the extractive sector revenues are spent affects economic growth, domestic security, well-being, pretty much everything that happens in a country. Very often, and Nigeria is a sort of textbook example that everybody points at, revenues are wasted or lost due to corruption or mismanagement. It's actually very hard for economies to manage these large and sudden inflows of resource wealth. It's notoriously difficult, which is why some people try to stagger it. If you get a sudden inflow of a huge amount of money, you can get high inflation because there's suddenly increased spending, or sharp inflows of foreign currency can cause the domestic currency to suddenly become overvalued. This is known as the Dutch disease. All of the money that comes in from extractives can actually sort of distort an economy because instead of doing productive investment, everybody's sort of attention, investment, and skilled labor goes from other economic sectors into the extractives. And yet the extractive sectors don't always create that many jobs. So you wind up with a lot of population that is unemployed and a few people who are working in the extractive sector. The actual process of extraction, exploring for oil, producing oil, mining, can create severe environmental damage. So anybody who's living in that area where extraction is taking place can have their livelihoods and their lives hurt. The social fabric becomes sort of torn apart. People flood into that area because they're looking for work or they're hoping to make money. All of a sudden you can have drugs, prostitution, and other crimes Other people get moved out. There can be much more tension between different classes or ethnic groups. People will start fighting over the resources, and so the extractive-fueled conflicts can last for years and years and years. Instead of doing something productive or developing the economy, instead of growing the pie, everybody stays to fight over who gets a share of the pie. So it can end up, paradoxically, with an abundance of natural resources leading to a lack of economic growth and an increase in economic and social inequality. Countries that have a lot of extractive sector can, not always, but can become marked by poverty, underdevelopment, and conflict. You can see from all of this that there are clearly lots of reasons why it's important for journalists to cover oil, gas, and mining. But paradoxically, in the countries that most need expert journalists to write about oil, gas, and mining, they often have the fewest. And of course, the journalists that do write about oil, gas, and mining face the difficulties that global muckrakers have always faced. So it's extremely complicated, and many newsrooms lack the expertise. They don't have the trained, experienced journalists who can really write about, who understand science, who understand tax law, who can read corporate balance sheets. That often doesn't exist. There's also a problem, there's also a lack of funding to send reporters out on stories. Covering the extractive sector means going to the place where the mining happens or where the oil is being drilled. And those places are often pretty far away and hard to get to. And companies and governments often ban journalists from going to those places. You know, we talked earlier in the Global Muckraking course about naming and shaming. How sometimes if you single out a company and you explain, or a government agency, and reporters explain all the terrible things that they've done, they'll be ashamed and they'll want to change and improve their ways. But for that to work, you need to have government agencies or people or companies that actually care about their reputation. Some of these extractive sector companies are so large and powerful that they actually don't feel obliged to provide information, and they don't much care if one small journalist covers something that they've done wrong. In fact, it's the opposite. Outside of the newsroom, the pressures and the information asymmetries are huge. The oil and gas and mining companies are rich, large, well-connected. They have friends in government and in business, and they can lean on them to make sure that bad stories don't appear about them. Sometimes they'll hire PR people and spin doctors, and they'll spend vast amounts of money to protect their image. They're savvy and they're sophisticated, and they have large PR teams. As well as trying to put their message across, they will also sometimes pressure journalists. Could be anything like a soft pressure, like a phone call saying, you know, we didn't like that, or why are you doing this? It can be smear campaigns where they just outright attack the outlets that criticize them. Large companies can threaten to withdraw advertising. They can even sue journalists. And those lawsuits, even if they have no merit, can drag on for years and years and years and just have the effect of silencing criticism. In many countries, the extractive sector is the major revenue source, and it creates some jobs. So people may be sympathetic to those companies and not really willing to listen to the journalism or the groups that criticize. So all the non-governmental organizations and the civil society groups and the journalists who question the practices of the extractive companies often may be viewed as marginal and actually find it pretty hard to even be heard. Those critics of the extractives may face litigation, arrest, and in some cases be attacked, physically attacked, or killed. And even when the journalists go ahead and write those hard-hitting stories and explain what's going on, the public doesn't necessarily want to hear about it. Nigeria and Angola are often considered sort of examples of that. People know there's corruption, they know all the problems, and when they read about it, it just makes them discouraged. They feel like efforts to fix problems just won't work. Despite the pronounced power asymmetries between journalists and extractive companies, there is some good news. The last few years have seen a general trend towards transparency. Thanks to things like big data, there's now more information available than ever before, and it's coming from a lot of different places. Countries that are compliant with the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative are giving out more information. The OECD, the UN, The European Union have really made a push against tax avoidance and also transparency. So there's more information that's available right now. There's also been investment in websites for journalists like Open Corporates and resourcecontracts.org that can be used by journalists or by other people so they can actually get more information now. We're starting to see good examples of journalists and citizens around the world making use of digital technology and social media to expose the problems in the extractive sector.